As many of you know, one of my biggest pet peeves is a lack of creativity in people. I expressed this a lot in a recent video complaining about competitive Mario Karters, namely the lounge players that seem to pick the same 5 courses over and over again in matches. The good news for me is I'm not a massive lounge player to begin with, as I prefer playing what I see as a more competitive format in 6-on-6. The bad news is that I also think that this problem extends over to these team matches as well, though in a slightly different and less frustrating way. Your team will always get to control half of the board at least, but this doesn't make your opposition's ideas, or lack thereof, any less frustrating. Time after time I've seen Mario Kart teams attempt to classify every track in the game. Dry Desert is a bagging course, Dolphin Shoals is a drafter. It's been the same song and dance for over a decade now, ever since those early Wii U days. Of course, time brings change, and sometimes even new games. And when secrets are passed down over the generations to the new players of today, sometimes we don't stop and question if certain strategies are actually potentially obsolete. So today, I want to talk about the classifications of old, because I do not believe that every type of track is as useful today, despite common consensus thinking the opposite. And at the end, I want to discuss the types of courses that I actually find helpful as well. There aren't many players left who are around to tell the stories of the days where we played Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U. But what is still funny to me is that the Wii U game in many ways shaped how the community still picks courses in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe today, because I find it to be for all the wrong reasons. So the Western community has always been a big advocate for 6 vs 6 team matches, and it was no different back in the Wii U era. Back then there were only 48 tracks in the game, but the more notable difference was in how the game was even played. In those Wii U days, intentionally sandbagging to pull lightning bolts was a practically non-existent concept. So was the idea of even pulling a mushroom at the first set of a race. This wasn't because the players were stupid or anything, this is just how the game worked back then. But this meant that we had a game where if a fast driver was starting in first place, it was incredibly difficult to displace them. And then if you add a bunch of other fast teammates around them, well, good luck. As such, some of the staple 6 vs 6 track picks back then were tracks like Dry Desert and Cheeseland. This was because these courses were some of the rare tracks that had enough off-road cuts to really counteract that massive advantage a frontrunner starting a race in first would ordinarily have in any given race. It's not that these courses provided any real advantage to players starting a race in the back of the pack. Anybody who quote "one lap won" on these tracks would still be at risk of being passed on all the shortcuts later in the race. So in a sense, these courses were just seen as a way to reset a team's advantage back to a more neutral state, or in other words, a 50-50. So for teams coming off a bad race back then, these tracks, often labeled reset tracks, were useful, because they simply offered an opportunity to break up a frontrunner's momentum. And because this was something that most tracks in the game couldn't easily do, it meant that this opportunity was often the best one you were going to get. You just couldn't really ask for much better than neutral when picking out of disadvantage on 8U. Yet, after Deluxe came out, people kept picking these courses for the exact same reasons as in 8U. There was an assumption that this was just how Mario Kart 8 was to be played. These courses were just perceived to provide a necessary reset, and believe it or not, I still see the same strategies employed today, especially in the lower level divisions. It's not necessarily with these 2 specific tracks, but with them in all of the new ones that are similar in structure. The issue I have here is that Deluxe is just a different game. You can pull mushrooms at the first set of a race now, and there are plenty of tracks with early shroom spots to pass people starting up front with ease, that don't have massive off-road shortcuts overall, especially ones that are at the end of courses. As such, there are courses now where you can take an early lead using shortcuts, but these tracks are still played like front-running tracks rather than bagging courses or reset tracks. But in Deluxe, even if you don't get up front early in a race, there's a heavier emphasis on item play in general now, with double items existing, and pulling the lightning bolt is also much more common as well. And this gives teams a way to wall break even on the heavy front-running tracks. It's not just the physical effect of a shock either that changes the game too. Even the mere threat of it will pull more of your opponents out of the front, since it can be risky to leave the bottom spots completely unchecked. So what this all means is that the reset courses of old are not really necessary track picks to make now. But not only are they just not necessary anymore, I would argue that they're not even close to being optimal picks. This is because due to all the changes with Deluxe, the game has quite a few courses where starting in the back of the pack actually provides an advantage over your opponent. And as such, picking a track that feels like a 50-50 no longer is your best possible option. Picking Cheeseland these days is not really asking for a chance to get out of the bottom spots, rather it's more of a coin flip now and can kind of feel like asking for a shock to determine the outcome for you. On many tracks in this game, being at the distance where shocks are commonly pulled can be a massive risk, and it can actually turn a player into a liability due to not being able to catch up. And this is why sandbagging is more of a reactionary strategy in 6-on-6 as opposed to a viable main plan. But still, there are some tracks where teams can safely bag, potentially pull multiple lightning bolts, and still catch up by the end of the race. And shocks always play a massive factor in the race outcome on these courses. The thing is, you don't get to determine which team pulls each shock. Because most of 8U's traditional reset courses turned into these heavy shock bagging tracks in Deluxe, picking these same reset courses isn't exactly a consistent strategy at all, nor is it one that stacks the deck in any team's favor, which again, is the entire purpose of strategic track picking. There was one match in particular that I played about a year ago that actually really stuck out to me. I've been playing the beginning of it here in the background footage, but we started off by striking fast with a race 1 top 4 on Bangkok Rush. And then on race 2, just like one of those old 8U matches, we got counterpicked to a sandbagging track. In this case, it was Mario Circuit 3. We ended up pulling 2 shocks by the end of the first lap and were able to stack them together, resulting in another really good race. And then the race after that, our opponents counterpicked to Cheeseland. This time we would pull 3 shocks, made great use out of stacking them together as well, and it led to an absolutely commanding lead only 3 races into the match. Now, these track selections might not have been reactionary counterpicks to bad races like in the past, since our opponents actually tried to get MC3 selected for the first race of the match too. And some teams are legitimately just better at playing tracks like these as well, and I believe that our opponents likely were one of those teams. It just did not work out well for them this time. But the widespread idea around the community that sandbagging courses, or baggers, are a vital part of any team's track picking arsenal is, in my mind, a myth originating from the game before. I genuinely do not really see a benefit in picking them over other tracks you might be more practiced on. Of course, I'm not going to sit here and say that you can't make these types of tracks work. Last video I advocated that players can really make any track work, especially if opponents aren't ready for them. But if you're going to pick bagging courses in your matches, you should at the very least understand what you should be picking them for. And that would be genuinely believing that you're better at them and their strategies. Because if you're just picking them to try to take advantage of RNG or because you've been told that they're a good reset course, I think you might just be throwing away a valuable pick that your team holds. Now, it is of course possible that there's an alternate timeline where our opponents got the extreme shock luck instead of us in this example, and typically speaking, it usually isn't this imbalanced to begin with. But the idea that a 20-point match can snowball into a 70-point deficit in just 2 races, largely due to factors that are out of a team's control, is why I would advise against picking traditional reset courses currently on a personal note. The strategy can be valid for a match, especially in a matchup against an overwhelming opponent, but it has the potential to backfire in the short term since you don't know if your team will actually be the one that's pulling the shocks, and shocks are often the win conditions on these tracks. The real damage though comes in the long term, however, because constantly relying on factors that are largely out of your control could possibly limit your growth as a team in my mind. You really should have other tracks to pick where you feel like you have an advantage on them, even in matches where your team is an underdog. As an example, there was a time where my team was a middle-of-the-road Mario Kart Wii team, and we actually were really good at Yoshi Falls of all things. Instinctively, one might question the usefulness of being able to drive an oval quickly, but we had results to back it up. There used to be a thing called territory wars on the old MK sites because there were really only 32 tracks in the game, but these territory wars were matches that were played on just one track, and as a middle to even low-level team, we were actually able to defeat a top division team at the time in a Yoshi Falls territory battle, which was really cool for us. And perhaps our opponents didn't take the match as seriously as we did, but it at least meant something to us, and I think it kind of does prove the point in question here. And when you consider Deluxe, a game with 96 tracks now, there are way more courses that you can attack that opponents might not have played recently. The track variety of this game directly works in your favor if you want to have multiple specialties that can catch opponents off guard, and I think if you practice them and you can get some of those picks, that might be just how you upset a higher ranked opponent on occasion. Going back to the idea of reset tracks, pretty soon into the game's meta, top teams started to realize that the reset courses of yesteryear just had a lot of problems in this game. Problems that courses like N64 Rainbow Road, commonly referred to as Trainbow, didn't have. So why N64 Rainbow Road? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but let's first talk about the only one people seem to discuss. The track is a, quote, drafter. Now, drafters have historically always kind of existed in Mario Kart, but the terminology once again settled in on the Wii U version of the game. And the idea here is that on drafting tracks, the player starting in first doesn't have an immediate advantage, because there are sections at the beginning of these courses where the players right behind them can draft them, pass them, and steal their front run. Like with bagging courses, this idea has somehow stuck through generations, and I see plenty of players of all skill levels still use the term drafter as a justifiable reason to select a track. And look, I don't exactly want to rain on any parades, it's not like it's an entirely unfounded idea or anything, but once again, I think we're missing context. As another reminder, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is a multifaceted game. Races are not always determined on lap 1, and a matter of fact, they usually aren't. It is true that getting an early lead and an advantage absolutely matters, especially in 6v6 play, but this game doesn't take it to the same level that the Wii U entry did. Leading lap 1 is anything but a checkmate. Opponents typically still have time to stop for coins, blue shells might be on the way, and double items and shocks might allow for easier comebacks as mentioned. So here's what I think. Like with bagging courses, you should not be picking a course just because you can draft up lap 1. You should instead be finding courses that your team is talented at and finding the situations where you want to pick them. Some of these tracks might have bagger, drafter, or just frontrunner elements to them, but those are complementary reasons to pick the track, not the main point of the selection. Because when a race breaks down, and it often will, there's a big question. Will you have the talent and ability to make it work anyway? If you're just picking the courses that other people tell you are the standard picks for 6v6, you probably aren't going to really be ahead of the pack on them. A lot of being good on a course is just being familiar with how it plays, or being fast at more than just the beginning sections. Every track has its own strategy, and like in the last video, it is on you and your teammates to find the ones that work. That being said, I will admit that 6v6 is definitely a bit more formulaic than the Lounge is. N64 Rainbow Road has not become a very polarizing track on accident. Yes, it is a drafting course, but it's also a short track with no off-road cuts and relatively few places to grab coins. Keep in mind the bottom positions start with 4 or 5 coins and first place starts with 0, which is significant. At the beginning of Sector 2, the pack is usually jumbled together. It is very hard to avoid fire flowers, boomerangs, green shells, you name it. And as such, taking a hit almost results in certain losses. This is because if you're up front, the fewer amount of coins you start with really hurts. And if you get hit here, you have minimal time to restock on coins, minimal shortcuts to take, and very little time to pull a shock. Deciding to drop to the back early in a race doesn't solve your problems either, because if you let opponents into first, it grants them a bigger advantage up front than the one you would have had by just front running, and this is entirely due to the coin differential. The best thing you can really do as somebody starting in the front here is just simply try to survive. But on average, your opponents will need to take 2 hits to go broke, whereas it will just be 1 for you. Trainbow is everything that Dry Desert was never. Yes, you could lose first on Dry Desert, but you always had a chance to strike back. On Trainbow, if you lose the front, you might just be losing it outright then and there. And that makes this track not a 50-50, but a track that heavily favors players starting in the back. And it's not alone, there are other tracks like it too. Tokyo Blur and New York Minute come to mind, rather short courses where coin collecting can be difficult, and there are plenty of other viable alternatives as well. So am I advocating that there should actually just be a specific track meta in 6v6? Well, not quite. Personally speaking, I do find N64 Rainbow Road in particular to be a problem. I've questioned many times over if it was actually ban-worthy in 6v6, as it is the strongest of its variety, I believe, and it has been over-centralizing at times. It comes up so frequently in teams because it is a track that you want to reap the benefits of just so your opponents can't do it back to you. Its results don't particularly seem dependent on team ability, but strictly the situation in which a team was able to pick it. And this is made worse when considering the ideal conditions for a selection are immediately after losing a race, so it almost feels like a reward for losing. I do think there is a case to be made that picking tracks so your opponents can't have them at particular times is a little bit much, especially for a game with 95 other options. There's no reason why we should be picking the same few every single match. In Deluxe, Trainbow has filled in as Wario Stadium's bottom spot counterpart. However, I find it to be much stronger. I am unconvinced that Wario Stadium is a naturally over-centralizing track in the same way, and that it might only appear to be because the community is simply used to it being common. But I admittedly felt that its strength has weakened over the years. This is not because the track has changed, but because players have. The game's always evolving. Funnily enough, a new strategy has been found online at the beginning of Trainbow, the Smart Glider, which makes drafting much more difficult, and if stuff like this happens, perhaps there will be other evolutions that change the game on it or other courses. Now, I've thought about one player potentially not getting the start up and just bagging early to try to cut off the ability for opponents in the back to draft as well. It's likely that this wouldn't work, and it's likely that even with the Smart Glider, Trainbow is still going to be a dominant counter pick, but it is likely that there are still other developments to be made on the track as well. And this brings me back to my original point from the last video. It's not just Trainbow that there will be developments on, because there are always going to be developments to make on every course, whether these are common ones or ones that we haven't played as much. And the good news is that practicing courses that others might not be familiar with not only is likely still effective in 6v6, but perhaps even amplified, since your teammates being stronger on a track will only help you out as well on the tracks that you've practiced. What is important is keeping an open mind and carefully observing where your team might have an advantage. So before I leave this topic, I of course have some Waluigi pinball propaganda to give. Today it is known as HD's track, but it was not always this way. Initially, I was actually the only one that liked it in the team. Many others called it trash or really bad because the pinball on lap 1 was annoying to them. But eventually a few players on our second roster agreed to play it with me. And we discovered that it, like probably most other tracks, was not competitively unviable. Matter of fact, it was quite the opposite. And after a while, I went back through my VODs and tallied the results, and I wanted to see what the data actually said. And in 54 races, I actually recorded a 71.3% win rate. Our average race on it was a plus 10 margin, which is pretty good, and over half the time we played it, we got a plus 10 race. A third of the races were plus 20 or better, which I would describe as the type of explosive races that win matches. Eventually, the results became undeniable, and the rest of the team started to become comfortable with it as well. And slowly but surely, it became a completely reliable pick for us. I feel like the 71% win rate has likely only improved since. So I think all teams should try to find stuff that they like to try to master. Some tracks will be harder to be consistent on. Keep in mind that pinball is a track with no off-road shortcuts, and it's really good for front runners. But I do believe teams can find value in lots of tracks, including the bagging courses, if they truly understand how to position themselves better than their opponents. But this will be up for you and your team to figure out. Only you know your track tastes, and unlike in the lounge queue, you have to convince teammates to try something in 6-on-6 as well. But I can say with certainty that there are likely some specialized tracks out there waiting for you. And if you follow your own results and have reasons to pick what you pick that aren't just due to some urban legend of the 8U days, I believe that there might be some success to follow when it's all said and done.